Hi, my name is Morgan and I am a neuroscience researcher and it's Valentine's Day. Well, not technically Valentine's Day, but this is the last video that I'll be putting out before Valentine's Day. So why not talk about love? Actually, what we'll be doing today is sort of talking about the opposite of love. Not hate, but what we're going to be talking about is oxytocin, which is otherwise known as the love hormone, but I have an issue with that name, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. So oxytocin is actually one of the things that I study. I study oxytocin and dopamine, and specifically in females, and so I deal a lot with it. And whenever you're explaining oxytocin to people, the easiest way to explain it is as the love hormone, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and it does so many more things than just love, and actually it doesn't even really do love. So I thought, because it's Valentine's Day, probably a lot of people are going to be talking about it. It tends to be something that every science magazine writes about every single Valentine's Day, and so I wanted to talk about all the things that they might not be discussing. I'll start off by giving a little bit of background. So if you're not familiar with oxytocin, don't worry, this isn't going to be a totally ununderstandable rant. But so like I said, oxytocin is called the love hormone, and I'll talk a little bit about why we think of it that way, even though that's sort of a misnomer. So the word oxytocin actually comes from the Greek word Oxytocin, which I will put down here because I definitely do not think that I pronounced that right. But that word means swift birth or quick birth. And the reason why it was named that is because the first research into oxytocin really had a lot to do with the birthing process, and oxytocin does have a lot to do with that. It's very involved in both the process of giving birth and maternal and paternal behaviors. Oxytocin is produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, but it can also be produced in the ovaries and the testes. It also acts very similar to vasopressin, which is another similar hormone also made in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, and oxytocin can actually bind to vasopressin receptors. So whenever they're studied, they're often studied together. So like I said, a lot of early research into oxytocin centered around the birthing process and the labor process. And it was discovered in the 1950s, and really soon after it was discovered, we actually started producing it synthetically and giving it to people who were in the process of giving birth. Oxytocin, from its discovery, we knew that it helped with stimulating the contractions that help with labor. It facilitates milk production, and it's also helps manage postpartum hemorrhaging. So if you're a person who's given birth, or you know someone who has, if they were given Pitocin, that contains oxytocin. And there was a lot of build up to the discovery of oxytocin, and a lot of stuff happened. There was a large period of time where we were like, we know a hormone's involved, but we don't know which one or what to call it. And I'll actually attach a really interesting paper about that in the description if you feel like reading it. So since the discovery of oxytocin, it's become one of the most well-studied hormones because it's just involved in so many things. So this is one of the reasons why the name the love hormone bothers me so much, is because yes, it's kind of sort of involved in love, but actually not really. And it does so many other things that aren't love that I find to be more interesting. So just to give a quick list of some of the things that we know that oxytocin does, it's involved in the regulation of water balance and blood osmolarity, so that's super important. It's involved in some cardiac functions. It's involved in your appetite and your fat metabolism, learning, memory, and it also may or may not have some preventative effects against addiction. So those are all really cool and not love related. But it's also involved in some social behaviors such as pair bonding and maternal and paternal behaviors. So is oxytocin involved in love? Yes, but also no. It does other things. So why do we call it the love hormone, and why does it bother me so much? So it's called the love hormone due mostly to a study that I think was done in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know, I'll put a link to the original study in the description if you feel like reading it. But it was a study done in prairie voles. So prairie voles are a type of rodent. I'll put a picture of them up. They're pretty cute. And prairie voles is just one type of vole. So this study involved two different types, the prairie voles and the meadow voles. Prairie voles are what's known as socially monogamous, which is an interesting concept. So as humans, whenever we think about monogamy, we think that two people love each other and they are going to only be with each other in whatever romantic or sexual ways that you want to think about it. But there's no other animal that we've found that really does that. So what researchers often use as a measure of monogamy is social monogamy, because there are a lot of species that will mate for life. They will find a pair and they will stick with that pair. But if you genetically test their offspring, they might have offspring from several different individuals, but they still socially are only with this one individual. So that's what socially monogamous is. So these prairie voles are socially monogamous. They will find one partner. They might have offspring by other partners, but they will live and exist with one partner. Another interesting thing about prairie voles is that both the male and the female are pretty equally involved in raising the young, even if the young is not that male's. So it's co-parenting as it should be in the prairie voles. Meadow voles, on the other hand, are not socially monogamous, not sexually monogamous, and the males are not super involved in raising the young. So they're kind of total opposites, but still in the same species, and they can be found in the same areas. So it's not like a regional difference. So this study that looked at these animals looked at oxytocin and vasopressin receptors and found that if they blocked oxytocin receptors, the prairie voles were no longer monogamous. Additionally, if they blocked oxytocin and vasopressin receptors at the same time, the voles weren't as socially interactive as they used to be. They wouldn't really seek out partners as much. So these studies showed two pretty important things. The first one being that oxytocin also affects males, which is something that beforehand was not thought to be the case because it was so involved in birth. They thought it was mostly a female thing. But no, it shows that it works in males. And it showed that oxytocin is involved in mate pairing or pair bonding or whatever you want to call it, finding a partner. Love, supposedly. So this was why I got dubbed the love hormone. But speaking from my own personal experience and talking to other people in the field, first of all, like I said, that's not all that it does. I listed all those other things that it does. And that might not actually be the case. Oxytocin receptors might actually not be that important in pair bonding. Why do I say this? So unfortunately, I can't link you to any papers on this. So as always, don't just trust people because they say something. Always do your own research. Hopefully papers will come up in the future and I will definitely be talking about them wherever they do come out. But at conferences and stuff, I have talked to other people who research oxytocin, and I've done research on oxytocin myself, where usually the finding is that the more socially monogamous ones don't have more or less oxytocin receptors. So you would think if oxytocin is more necessary to be monogamous, then monogamous species would have more oxytocin or more oxytocin receptors, but that's not what we find. I've talked to people who study this in all sorts of different species, and the general consensus seems to be that it's true for prairie voles that this is necessary, or for voles in general that this is necessary, but that might not translate to other species as well as we think that it does. So, like I said, take everything that I say with a grain of salt, do your own research, don't just trust random people on the internet. That's why I link to all of my sources always, so that you don't have to just trust me, but this is what I've heard and what is sort of currently going on in the field to the best of my knowledge. So if I don't think that oxytocin should be called the love hormone, what do I think that it does other than love? I listed some of the physiological things that it does earlier, but what does it do to us mentally? What does it do to us psychology-wise? Some people have proposed that it's more of a bonding hormone and it kind of increases trust. So there's been some studies in humans where they've given humans intranasal oxytocin, which is just like a little nose spray that you put in your nose. It's like Flonase, but it's oxytocin instead of something to help with that. And these studies find that the people who are given the oxytocin are more trusting of other people. But trust is sort of a difficult thing to measure, and it's also an extremely difficult thing to replicate. Some other people have done these studies and found that it doesn't have any influence. Also, there's always an issue with studies that use intranasal oxytocin because it goes in your nose, not in your brain. And so we don't know where in your brain it's going or even if it makes its way to your brain. So there's some issues with that concept. In addition to not necessarily being involved in love, it actually is very involved in aggression and territoriality. So specifically, it's very involved in maternal aggression. So the stereotype of a mama bear. That's oxytocin. So something that has given birth is likely to be more aggressive and territorial in order to protect their young, and that is also proportional to the amount of oxytocin that's in their system. If they have more oxytocin, they're going to be more territorial and more protective. It can also be involved in the territoriality of males. I'm not saying that this goes for humans. I think that we get into really sketchy territory whenever we try to take things from rodents to humans sometimes, and we need to be careful what we say. So I'm not excusing territorial or possessive male humans, but in rodents, there's been studies that show that whenever a female and a male pair bond, they've chosen each other, they're going to stick with each other, the male will get more territorial and aggressive towards strangers, and even attractive, sexually available females, they will be like really mean to and attack and get very territorial. So it's involved in that form of aggression as well. Another way that I specifically study oxytocin is in motivation and in stressful situations. So the amount of oxytocin in your system actually increases whenever you're in a stressful situation, and it's thought that that's meant to sort of calm us down, because oxytocin also increases the amount of dopamine in your system. So if you have more dopamine, you're going to be not necessarily happier, but maybe less stressed. Lucy came to say hi. Hello. So if you have more oxytocin and more dopamine in your system, you're less likely to be as anxious or as stressed about things. So that's sort of the thought there. There's a lot of more research that needs to be done in order to prove that hypothesis. Something that I thought was kind of fun whenever I was researching this is that oxytocin can increase your yawning, like how many times you yawn. And we have no clue why, but that's just a fun physiological thing that it does. Oxytocin is also vital to the interpretation of social information. So something that I think is really interesting and that I need to do more reading on in order to talk about it correctly is that oxytocin's thought to be involved in autism. So it's thought to be involved in the social deficits that come along with autism. And this is partially why, because we think that it has to do with interpreting social information. Oxytocin is also necessary for identifying people, and so since it does have so much to do with sociality, if you block oxytocin receptors in rodents, they will, even an animal that they're very familiar with, they will treat as if it is a brand new animal that they've never met. Oxytocin also increases your memory of social situations, so it's part of why it's easier to remember whenever you were interacting with someone rather than whenever you were alone. It is interesting to note that all of the effects that I've just listed of oxytocin are higher in more positive social interactions. So it increases your social memory more whenever the social interaction is positive than whenever the social interaction is negative. So that's fun, and we still aren't totally sure what that's about. A fun question that I think I get asked like a disproportionate amount whenever I mention that I study oxytocin is a lot of people ask if we can give it to psychopaths. So one of the concepts is that if oxytocin increases bonding and increases trust and sociality, if we gave it to antisocial people or to psychopaths or whatever other disorder you want to list that causes antisocial behavior, would it help? Would it cause them to be more social? And the answer is maybe. So there's been a lot of studies on this. Specifically, there's some researchers who have gone into prisons and given psychopaths intranasal oxytocin. Like I said, there's issues with giving intranasal oxytocin, and the studies were very mixed. Sometimes it would help, sometimes it would have no effect. So I don't think it's something that we can just go around prescribing all the time now. They do sell like an oxytocin, like an intranasal oxytocin, or like perfumes with oxytocin in them to like supposedly increase people's attraction to you, or like if you give your boyfriend some intranasal oxytocin, maybe that helps things. Those are all marketing gimmicks. Don't trust them. There's no research behind them. So I don't recommend it. Just wear some normal perfume and smell good, and that'll help. So I hope that was interesting for you. Maybe you learned something new about the love hormone. I could rant about it for a very long time, but I'm not going to. If you'd like to see more videos about the things that oxytocin does, or about my research, or dopamine, motivation, any of those things, just let me know in a comment below. You can also email me video suggestions at askaneuroresearcher@gmail.com. You can find all of the links for the sources that I used today in the description below. Also, in the description, I'm going to put a link to my last video. I forgot to say this at the beginning, but I had some issues with copyright things. So the video that would normally come out on Wednesday came out on Thursday of last week. So if you missed that, I'll put the link in the description. Also, please go follow me on social medias. I'll list them all here somewhere. I'm planning a video soon where I will be asking questions on my Twitter and my Instagram. So if you go follow me on those, you might be able to be involved in one of my upcoming videos. I've also been uploading some stuff to TikTok lately. So if you go follow me on TikTok, you'll get to see my lab. So that might be interesting. You can also suggest to me what to do on TikTok because I do not know what I'm doing on that platform. And with all of that, I hope that you have a happy Valentine's Day or a totally normal Sunday, whatever it is that you're wanting to do. And I will see you next Wednesday. Bye.